Min-jae, tell me you didn't do this.
I only wanted her to leave, Dad.
You could have killed her.
At 4:17 in the morning, one of Seoul's most heavily guarded mansions was supposed to be completely silent. Baek Hyun-woo had spent years making sure that nothing happened inside his home without his knowledge. Men with earpieces guarded the gates. Cameras covered every corridor. Security personnel watched the grounds through the night. The Baek family had enemies powerful enough to make a single mistake fatal. Yet none of that security could prevent what happened inside the mansion that morning. A violent crash shattered the silence, followed by a woman's scream. When Hyun-woo reached the marble staircase, he found 25-year-old Kamaria Revels lying on the floor, one hand gripping her injured ankle and the other trembling against the cold marble. Her breathing was shallow. Her face was wet with tears. For several seconds, the feared mafia boss simply stared at her, unable to understand how the woman who had entered his home 3 weeks earlier with nothing but a suitcase and a determination to work had ended up on the floor of his mansion before sunrise. Hyun-woo dropped beside her and carefully placed one hand behind her shoulders. Kamaria tried to speak, but the pain made the words barely audible. He looked at the staircase, then back at her. There was something about the scene that immediately felt wrong. Kamaria had been careful since her first day in the mansion. She knew the polished floors could become dangerous when wet. She knew the household routines. She had never fallen before. Then Hyun-woo noticed something shining beneath the pale morning light. A thin, oily substance covered part of the marble near the edge of the staircase. He touched it with his fingertips. The smell told him everything. Cooking oil. His expression changed instantly. This wasn't an accident. Someone had deliberately put it there. And as the security guards rushed toward them, Hyun-woo slowly raised his head and looked toward the upper landing. Standing there was his 16-year-old son, Baek Min-jae. The boy who had spent years driving every maid out of the mansion was staring down at the woman he had spent the last 3 weeks trying to break. But this time there was no arrogance in his face. There was fear. Hyun-woo stood slowly. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. Everyone in that mansion knew what his silence meant. He looked directly at his son and asked the one question that would eventually change the entire Baek family. "Did you do this?" Min-jae didn't answer. His eyes moved from his father to Kamaria, then back again. For the first time since Hyun-woo could remember, his son looked like a frightened child rather than the arrogant teenager who had made grown adults afraid to work inside the mansion. Hyun-woo took one step toward him. "Did you put the oil on the floor?" Min-jae finally lowered his head. His voice was almost impossible to hear. He said he only wanted her to leave. Hyun-woo stared at him as if he had never seen his own son before. He asked again whether Min-jae understood what could have happened. The boy remained silent. Then Hyun-woo looked back at Kamaria, who was being carefully lifted by the security team. Her injury had already changed something inside him. But what happened next would change his son even more. Because Min-jae had not intended to kill Kamaria. He hadn't even intended to seriously injure her. In his mind, it was supposed to be another cruel trick, another humiliation designed to convince the newest maid that she had made a terrible mistake by entering the Baek mansion. He believed she would slip, become frightened, perhaps cry, and finally submit her resignation. He had done things like this before. 9 women had entered his father's home before Kamaria, and 9 had eventually walked away. Some lasted weeks, some lasted days. One had left before finishing her first weekend. Min-jae had always watched them leave with the same cold satisfaction, convinced that he was protecting his father and his mother's memory. But this time, his plan had gone further than he ever imagined. The woman he wanted gone had been carried out of the mansion injured. His father had discovered the truth. And somewhere beneath Min-jae's anger, a terrible realization was beginning to form. For the first time, he could no longer pretend that his cruelty was harmless. Yet the most surprising part of the story was not what Min-jae had done. It was what happened after Kamaria was taken to the hospital. Because Hyun-woo would soon discover that his son's hatred of the maids had never really been about money, loyalty, or even obedience. It was about grief. It was about a 16-year-old boy who had spent years believing that every woman who entered his father's life was one step closer to replacing the mother he had lost. And Kamaria, without knowing it, had walked directly into the center of that wound. She had not come to the Baek mansion looking for love. She had not come looking for power. She had come because she needed a job, because she had dreams she could no longer afford, and because she believed that if she worked hard enough, she could build a future for herself in a country thousands of miles from the life she once knew. She had no idea that within 3 weeks, she would become the only person in the mansion who could see the pain behind Min-ye's cruelty. And Hyun-woo had no idea that the woman lying injured on his marble floor would eventually become the woman he would ask to stay in his life forever. But to understand why a powerful mafia boss's teenage son could hate a woman he had barely known, we have to go back to the beginning. 3 weeks earlier, before the fall, before the hospital, before the accusation, Kamaria Revels arrived at the Baek mansion carrying a small suitcase and a job offer she desperately needed. She knew the family was wealthy. She knew the head of the household was powerful. She had heard rumors about the security around the estate. What she did not know was that the mansion had become famous among domestic workers for an entirely different reason. People didn't fear Baek Hyun-woo nearly as much as they feared his son. And the first thing Kamaria would learn after walking through those gates was that the boy everyone else had given up on had already decided she would be the 10th woman to leave his home in tears. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. 3 weeks before Kamaria Revels was carried from the Baek mansion, the estate stood behind enormous iron gates on one of Seoul's most exclusive private roads. From the outside, it looked less like a home and more like a fortress designed for a man who had spent his entire life expecting enemies. Tall stone walls surrounded perfectly maintained gardens. Black vehicles moved through the gates at all hours. Security guards watched every entrance, and cameras covered nearly every corner of the property. To anyone passing by, the Baek mansion represented wealth, influence, and absolute control. But among domestic workers, the mansion had a very different reputation. Employment agencies knew the name. Experienced housekeepers knew the name. And whenever the Baek family requested another maid, applicants were warned about one person before they were told anything else. His name was Baek Min-jae. 9 women had entered those gates before Kamaria. 9 had eventually resigned. Some had lasted months. Others had barely lasted a week. According to the resignation letters, the reasons were different, but the pattern was always the same. Min-jae made sure they did not stay. The competitor transcript similarly establishes a mansion where repeated resignations are directly connected to the wealthy owner's son and his treatment of household workers. At 16, Min-jae had already learned how to use his family name like a weapon. He knew that security guards would never question him. He knew that employees could not simply walk away from the son of Baek Hyun-woo. And most importantly, he knew exactly what frightened people. He would deliberately create impossible tasks, embarrass new workers, question their motives, and watch carefully for the moment they finally decided they had had enough. To him, every new maid represented the same threat. He believed women did not come into his father's mansion because they wanted honest work. He believed they came because they saw an opportunity. Money. Status. A connection to one of Seoul's most powerful men. And beneath that suspicion was something far more personal. Min-jae's mother had died when he was young. After her death, the boy who had once followed his father through the mansion began changing. He became withdrawn, angry, and fiercely protective of everything that remained of his mother's memory. Every new woman near his father became, in his mind, a possible replacement. He didn't understand that his father wasn't searching for a replacement. He only understood that people he loved could disappear, and he had decided he would never allow another person to get close enough to take his mother's place. That belief explained Min-jae's behavior, but it did not excuse it. The question was whether the 16-year-old was simply a spoiled rich kid who had learned that money could protect him from consequences, or whether there was something deeper beneath the arrogance everyone saw. The answer was known to one person, Baek Hyun-woo. At 36, Hyun-woo had built a reputation that made powerful men think twice before challenging him. He controlled legitimate businesses that appeared respectable from the outside, while his influence reached much deeper into Seoul's criminal underworld. A phone call from him could open a door that had been closed to everyone else. Another phone call could make a problem disappear. His employees feared him. His enemies respected him. His rivals studied him carefully because they knew that Hyun-woo rarely acted without a reason. Yet inside the walls of his own mansion, the most difficult problem in his life was not an enemy, a rival organization, or a business dispute. It was his 16-year-old son sitting across from him at the dinner table. Hyun-woo knew Min-jae was hurting. He knew his son's anger had begun after his mother's death. He knew the boy had become suspicious of every woman who entered their lives. He even knew that some of Min-jae's cruelty came from fear rather than hatred. But there was one thing Hyun-woo had never told his son. The reason he had become so distant after his wife's death was not because he stopped caring about Min-jae. It was because he blamed himself for what had happened to her. He had spent years believing that his enemies had taken away the woman he loved, and he had responded by turning himself into a harder, colder man. Instead of grieving with his son, he buried himself in power and work. Instead of explaining why he could not talk about Min-jae's mother, he allowed silence to fill the space between them. Min-jae interpreted that silence differently. He believed his father had simply moved on. So while Hyun-woo thought he was protecting his son from the dangers of his world, Min-jae believed he was protecting his mother's memory from being erased. That misunderstanding had quietly shaped the Baek household for years. Hyun-woo knew the truth, but he had never found the courage to tell his son. And Min-jae had never asked the question directly because he was afraid of the answer. Then Kamaria Revels arrived. She did not know about the private history between father and son. She did not know about the woman whose photograph remained inside a locked room. She did not know why Min-jae became angry whenever another woman entered the house. All she knew was that she needed work, and that the Baek family was willing to pay enough for her to continue pursuing the future she had nearly been forced to abandon. She believed she was walking into a difficult job. She had no idea she was walking into the unfinished grief of a father, the anger of a 16-year-old boy, and the carefully guarded heart of a 36-year-old mafia boss. And there was another reason Hyun-woo had accepted Kamaria's application when other applicants had walked away. During their interview, she had not tried to impress him. She had not exaggerated her abilities. She had not pretended that his reputation frightened her. She simply explained that she needed the opportunity and intended to earn it through hard work. Hyun-woo had interviewed enough people to recognize desperation disguised as ambition. Kamaria's desperation was different. She wasn't looking for a shortcut into a wealthy family. She was trying to build a life of her own. That distinction mattered to him. What he didn't know was that Min-jae had been listening from somewhere nearby. The boy had heard that another maid was coming. He had already decided what would happen next. 9 women had entered the mansion before Kamaria, and none had survived his tests for long. In his mind, Kamaria would become number 10. But Min-jae had made one mistake. He had assumed Kamaria would behave like everyone who came before her. He had no idea that the woman walking through those gates would refuse to play by the rules he had created. She would not fight him with anger. She would not beg him for acceptance. And when he tried to make her feel powerless, she would respond in a way that would leave him more confused than any argument ever could. Because Kamaria would soon discover something about Baek Min-jae that even his father had struggled to understand. The boy wasn't simply trying to make every maid leave. He was testing whether anyone would stay. And 3 weeks later, that question would lead him to put oil on the marble floor outside Kamaria's room. What he didn't know was that his final test would become the moment his father discovered the truth about him. And after that morning, the Baek family would never be the same. Kamaria Revels arrived at the Baek mansion on a gray morning in Seoul with one suitcase, a folder containing her employment documents, and a determination she had spent months trying to protect. She had not come to the mansion because she dreamed of serving a powerful family. She had come because the job offered something she desperately needed, enough money to continue her education. Her studies had already been interrupted once because the cost had become too much, and she had promised herself she would not allow another financial setback to decide the rest of her life. She knew very little about Baek Hyun-woo beyond what she had been told during the interview. She knew he was wealthy. She knew he was powerful. She knew his mansion was heavily guarded. And she knew his 16-year-old son had a reputation for making employees leave. But Kamaria had already made her decision. She would work honestly, keep her dignity, save what she could, and eventually return to school. What she didn't know was that the moment she crossed through those gates, Baek Min-jae was already watching her. The mansion was even larger than Kamaria had imagined. The driveway curved through carefully maintained gardens before reaching enormous stone steps leading toward the main entrance. Security personnel stood discreetly around the property, and every movement near the gates appeared to be monitored. But what caught Kamaria's attention wasn't the size of the house. It was how quiet it felt. There were expensive paintings on the walls, carefully arranged furniture, polished floors, and rooms that seemed designed to impress anyone who entered. Yet the atmosphere felt strangely empty. It was the kind of silence that suggested people lived there without truly living together. Mrs. Han Mi-sook, the longtime household manager, greeted Kamaria and explained the basic routines. She was polite, professional, and noticeably careful whenever she mentioned Min-yi. Kamaria noticed it immediately. She asked whether there was anything special she needed to know about the family. Mrs. Han hesitated before answering. She told Kamaria that the young master preferred things done his way. Then she added something that made Kamaria pause. She said 9 women had already left the position. Kamaria didn't immediately react. She simply asked why. Mrs. Han looked toward the staircase before answering. She said Min-yi didn't like having strangers in the house. Kamaria asked whether he had always been that way. Mrs. Han gave a quiet answer that revealed more than she intended. No, he hadn't. The boy had changed after his mother died. Kamaria looked toward the hallway. Before she could ask anything else, footsteps approached. Baek Hyun-woo entered the room. At 36, he carried himself with the quiet authority of someone who never needed to announce his power. He looked at Kamaria carefully, not as though he were inspecting a servant, but as though he were trying to understand the person who had just walked into the most complicated part of his life. He welcomed her and asked whether Mrs. Han had explained the household responsibilities. Kamaria said yes. Then Hyun-woo paused before giving her the warning that had caused so many applicants to reconsider the job. My son doesn't want another maid in this house. Kamaria looked at him calmly. She didn't ask whether Min-yi was dangerous. She didn't ask whether she could have extra protection. She simply asked what Hyun-woo expected her to do if his son tried to make her leave. Hyun-woo told her that he couldn't guarantee Min-yi would make her work easy. Kamaria considered that for a moment. Then she answered with a sentence Hyun-woo would remember long after the conversation ended. She said that perhaps his son needed to learn that people weren't disposable. Hyun-woo's expression changed slightly. He had expected fear. He had expected hesitation. He had even expected Kamaria to reconsider the position after hearing about the previous 9 maids. Instead, she had spoken about his son as though he were simply a troubled teenager who needed boundaries. For several seconds, Hyun-woo said nothing. Then he told her that if she was willing to accept the job, the position was hers. Kamaria thanked him and followed Mrs. Han toward the staff quarters. Neither woman noticed the figure standing on the upper balcony. Min-yi had been watching the entire conversation. He had seen the way his father looked at Kamaria. He had heard her say that people weren't disposable, and he had immediately made his judgment. Another woman had arrived believing she could understand his family. Another person had decided that his anger was something she could fix. Min-yi's jaw tightened. He had seen this before. New employees arrived with confidence, lasted a few days, and eventually discovered that the Baek mansion wasn't a place where people simply walked in and became part of the family. He decided Kamaria would leave within a week. In his mind, the only question was how quickly he could make that happen. Kamaria's first morning passed quietly. She learned the kitchen schedule, organized the household supplies, and began preparing the rooms according to Mrs. Han's instructions. She worked without trying to draw attention to herself. She didn't ask questions about the family's wealth. She didn't stare at the security personnel. She didn't gossip about Hyun-woo, and she didn't mention Min-yi. That last part was what irritated him most. By lunchtime, he had already noticed that she hadn't reacted to his presence. When he walked into a room, other employees usually became nervous. Kamaria simply continued working. When he passed her in the hallway, she greeted him politely and continued on her way. To Min-yi, that calmness felt like a challenge. He waited until Kamaria had finished cleaning the main sitting room. The marble floor had been polished until it reflected the light from the enormous windows. Kamaria placed her cleaning supplies aside and stepped toward the adjoining hallway. Min-yi walked into the room carrying a glass of juice. He looked at the spotless floor, then at Kamaria. Without saying anything, he tilted the glass and deliberately spilled the drink across the marble. The liquid spread quickly across the surface she had just cleaned. Min-yi watched her carefully. He expected anger. He expected frustration. More importantly, he expected tears. Kamaria looked at the spill, then at him. Her expression barely changed. She walked over to the cleaning cart, picked up a cloth, and held it out toward him. Min-yi stared at her hand. He asked what she was doing. Kamaria calmly told him that he had made the mess. Min-yi looked at the cloth as though she had handed him something absurd. He asked whether she was telling him to clean it. Kamaria shook her head. She told him she was giving him the opportunity. For several seconds, neither moved. The boy who had made 9 women cry was suddenly standing in silence because the newest maid had refused to play the role he had assigned her. Kamaria placed the cloth on the table and walked away without another word. Min-yi remained beside the spill. He looked at the cloth. Then he looked toward the hallway where Kamaria had disappeared. He was not used to this. People usually responded to his cruelty with fear, anger, or tears. Kamaria had responded with something much more difficult for him to understand: calmness. That evening, Min-yi told himself he wasn't bothered. He told himself Kamaria was simply pretending to be strong. He told himself every person had a breaking point, and eventually he would find hers. But there was a problem he hadn't anticipated. For the first time in years, Min-yi had met someone who wasn't afraid of him. And instead of making him lose interest, it made him more determined than ever. He didn't yet know what Kamaria had survived before entering the Baek mansion. He didn't know why she refused to let humiliation define her. He didn't know what she was secretly studying late at night after everyone else had gone to bed. And he certainly didn't know that the woman he had just decided to break would eventually understand the grief he had spent years hiding from his own father. Min-yi only knew one thing: Kamaria Revels had survived her first day, and he had no intention of letting her survive the second. By the end of Kamaria Revels' first day, Baek Min-jae had already decided that she was different. He didn't like that conclusion, because admitting it meant admitting that his usual methods weren't working. The next morning, he watched her from a distance as she moved through the mansion with the same quiet confidence she had shown on her first day. She didn't seek attention, and she didn't seem interested in the family's wealth. She simply worked, but Min-jae was watching for something else. He wanted evidence that her calmness was an act. He wanted to find the weakness hidden underneath it. What he didn't realize was that Kamaria had already begun noticing something about him too. His cruelty appeared whenever someone got close to his father. His anger became stronger when Hyun-woo showed kindness toward another woman. And whenever the subject of his mother came up, the confident teenager suddenly became someone else entirely. Kamaria didn't understand the reason yet, but she knew there was a story behind his behavior. A few days later, Kamaria was carrying folded laundry through the east wing of the mansion when she noticed Min-jae walking toward a hallway that employees rarely used. The corridor ended at an old wooden door that remained locked most of the time. Min-jae looked around before taking a small key from his pocket. Kamaria stopped several meters away. She had no intention of following him, but something about the way he looked over his shoulder made her pause. He wasn't behaving like the arrogant boy she had seen downstairs. He looked nervous, almost vulnerable. He unlocked the door and disappeared inside. A few moments later, Kamaria saw him emerge holding a framed photograph. He pressed it against his chest for a moment before quickly noticing her. His expression hardened immediately. The vulnerability disappeared. He tucked the photograph against his side and told her she shouldn't be in that hallway. Kamaria apologized and continued walking. She didn't ask who was in the photograph. She didn't need to. The expression on Min-jae's face had already told her that the person mattered. That evening, Kamaria asked Mrs. Han Mi-sook about the locked room. She did it carefully, without mentioning that she had seen Min-jae carrying the photograph. Mrs. Han was silent for several seconds. She had worked in the Baek household for years, and she knew which subjects were safe and which ones could reopen wounds that had never properly healed. Eventually, she told Kamaria that the room had belonged to Min-jae's mother. She had died when Min-jae was still a young boy. After that, the room was preserved almost exactly as she had left it. Her belongings remained inside. Her photographs remained on the shelves. Even some of her favorite books had never been moved. Mrs. Han explained that Hyun-woo had struggled after losing his wife, but his son had struggled differently. Hyun-woo became more protective. He increased security. He became stricter about who entered the household. He wanted to make sure nothing else could ever happen to his son. But what began as protection eventually became control. Min-jae had grown up surrounded by rules designed to keep him safe. He couldn't go anywhere without security. He couldn't trust strangers. He couldn't bring people home without his father's approval. And whenever a new woman appeared in Hyun-woo's life, Min-jae became suspicious. Mrs. Han told Kamaria that after his mother's death, the boy had developed a fear he rarely admitted aloud. He believed his father would eventually love someone else, and that, once that happened, his mother's place in the family would disappear. Kamaria listened quietly. Suddenly, the previous 9 maids looked different in her mind. Their resignations had not simply been caused by a spoiled teenager trying to control the household. Min-jae had been testing them. Every time he pushed a woman away, he was asking the same question without realizing it. Would my father choose her over my mother? Would he choose her over me? And if the answer might someday be yes, then perhaps it was safer to make sure nobody ever got close enough to ask. That realization changed the way Kamaria saw him. It didn't excuse what he had done. It didn't erase the humiliations or the deliberate attempt to make her leave, but it explained why his anger appeared whenever Hyun-woo showed interest in her. Min-jae didn't hate maids because they were maids. He hated what their presence represented. To him, every woman who entered the Baek mansion carried the possibility of losing his father all over again. He had never learned how to separate his mother's death from the fear of his father's future, and Hyun-woo had never explained the truth. The father had been so consumed by guilt that he had convinced himself silence was protecting his son. The son had interpreted that silence as proof that his father didn't understand him. For years, both of them had been living inside the same grief, but they had been standing on opposite sides of it. Later that night, Kamaria found Min-jae sitting alone outside his mother's locked room. The mansion was quiet. He wasn't holding the photograph anymore. It rested beside him on the floor, turned slightly toward the wall. Kamaria could have walked past him. She could have reminded herself that he had spent the previous day deliberately spilling a drink across the floor she had just cleaned. She could have remembered the way he had looked at her when he decided she would not last a week. Instead, she stopped. She didn't ask whether he was all right. She didn't tell him that his behavior was wrong. She simply sat several feet away from him. Min-jae looked at her with suspicion. He asked what she wanted. Kamaria told him she didn't want anything. He asked why she was sitting there. She said she didn't know, maybe because she had noticed he looked lonely. That answer irritated him. He told her she didn't know anything about him. Kamaria agreed. She said she didn't. Then she added that she didn't need to know everything to understand that he was hurting. Min-jae's expression changed. For several seconds, he stared at the floor. Then he asked her a question that sounded less like a challenge and more like something he had wanted to ask someone for years. He asked why she wasn't scared of him. Kamaria looked at him and answered calmly. She said it was because she didn't think he was as cruel as he wanted everyone to believe. Min-jae immediately looked away. The words had reached somewhere he had spent years protecting. He stood, picked up the photograph, and walked toward his bedroom without another word. He didn't apologize. He didn't thank her. He didn't suddenly become kind. But something had changed. For the first time, someone had looked past his behavior without pretending that his behavior was acceptable. Kamaria hadn't called him evil. She hadn't called him spoiled. She had simply suggested that the person he was showing the world wasn't the whole person he had become. The next morning, Min-jae behaved exactly as though the conversation had never happened. He walked past Kamaria without greeting her. He ignored her when she placed breakfast on the table. He acted distant whenever his father entered the room. But later that afternoon, Kamaria noticed something strange. The cleaning supplies she normally carried from one side of the mansion to the other had already been placed exactly where she needed them. No one admitted doing it. Mrs. Han said she hadn't touched them. Kamaria looked toward the staircase. Min-jae was standing there for a moment before turning away. It was a small gesture. Almost meaningless, but Kamaria understood what it meant. Min-jae had not changed yet. He was simply beginning to wonder whether he could. And that question would become dangerous, because just as Min-jae was starting to see Kamaria differently, Baek Hyun-woo was beginning to notice something even more complicated. His son was changing around her. And for the first time since his wife's death, Hyun-woo was beginning to wonder whether the woman he had hired to work inside his mansion might be doing something no one else had been able to do. She might be bringing his family back together. But Hyun-woo had no idea that this new closeness would soon create a completely different problem. Because the more Kamaria became part of the household, the harder it became for Hyun-woo to see her as simply an employee. And when Min-jae eventually noticed the way his father looked at her, the fear that had been buried inside him for years would return stronger than ever. Something had begun to change inside the Baek mansion, and Baek Hyun-woo noticed it before anyone else did. It wasn't dramatic at first. There were no announcements, no apologies, and no sudden transformation in Baek Min-jae's personality. The changes were small enough that another person might have ignored them. But Hyun-woo had spent 16 years studying his son, and he knew exactly how unusual they were. Min-jae had started coming downstairs for breakfast instead of eating alone in his room. He had stopped deliberately provoking Mrs. Han Mi-sook. One afternoon, Hyun-woo overheard him quietly apologizing to her after speaking disrespectfully the day before. Mrs. Han looked almost stunned. She had worked in the Baek household for years, and she couldn't remember the last time Min-jae had apologized without being forced. Then came the biggest change. For the first time in months, Min-jae sat through an entire family dinner without leaving the table. Hyun-woo watched him from across the room, trying to understand what had happened. The answer was sitting nearby. Kamaria Revels. Kamaria never claimed credit for any of it. When Min-jae came downstairs for breakfast, she simply served him. When he apologized to Mrs. Han, she didn't praise him as though he were a child who had accomplished something extraordinary. When he remained at dinner, she treated it as normal. That was what made the difference. Kamaria wasn't trying to control Min-jae. She wasn't trying to replace his mother. She wasn't trying to become part of the Baek family. She was simply treating him as a young man who still had the ability to choose what kind of person he wanted to become. Hyun-woo began noticing that whenever Kamaria entered a room, Min-jae's behavior changed. He didn't become perfect. He still had an attitude. He still carried anger. But he seemed less interested in proving how powerful he could be. For years, Hyun-woo had responded to his son's behavior with stricter rules, more security, more restrictions, and longer lectures. None of it had worked. Kamaria had never given him a lecture. Somehow, she had reached a part of his son that Hyun-woo couldn't reach. One evening, Hyun-woo returned home earlier than expected. The mansion was quiet, and most of the household had already finished their duties for the night. As he walked past the library, he noticed a faint light beneath the door of a small sitting room. He expected to find Mrs. Han organizing something, but when he opened the door, he found Kamaria sitting alone at a small table. Her work was finished, yet several accounting textbooks and handwritten notes were spread in front of her. She immediately began gathering them when she realized Hyun-woo was standing there. He asked what she was doing. She explained that she was studying. Hyun-woo looked at the books and then at her. He remembered that she had mentioned her education during her interview, but he hadn't realized she was still studying after completing long days inside his mansion. He asked why she hadn't told him. Kamaria looked at him for a moment before answering that she had come to the Baek mansion to work, not to ask him for favors. That answer stayed with Hyun-woo. He had met hundreds of people who approached him because of his wealth. Some wanted protection. Some wanted money. Some wanted access to his business connections. Some wanted to be close to his family because they believed his name could change their lives. Kamaria was different. She had an opportunity to ask for help and had deliberately chosen not to. Hyun-woo asked whether she intended to return to school. She said that was the plan if she could save enough. He asked how long that would take. She smiled and told him she didn't know. She had learned not to make promises about things she couldn't control. Hyun-woo looked at the books again. Then he realized something that made him uncomfortable. He respected her. Not because she worked hard for his family, but because she had managed to maintain a sense of independence inside a household where almost everyone else depended on his power. From that night forward, Hyun-woo began noticing Kamaria in ways he hadn't allowed himself to before. He noticed how she spoke to Min-jae without humiliating him. He noticed how she treated Mrs. Han with respect. He noticed that she never used his name to gain privileges. He noticed that she would sometimes stay in the kitchen after everyone else had gone to bed simply to prepare something Min-jae liked because she knew he had barely eaten that day. He noticed the way she studied quietly when she thought nobody was watching. And slowly, something changed inside him. Hyun-woo began looking forward to seeing her. Conversations that once lasted a minute began lasting 10. Questions about the household became questions about her life. He wanted to know what she had studied, what she wanted to become, why she had chosen Korea, and what she had left behind. He knew he shouldn't be thinking about her this way. She was his employee. There was a clear line between them, and Hyun-woo had spent his entire adult life understanding boundaries. But emotions didn't always respect the rules people created for themselves. Hyun-woo never told Kamaria what was happening inside him. He kept his distance whenever he felt himself becoming too comfortable. He deliberately shortened conversations. He returned to his office when he wanted to stay in the kitchen. He reminded himself that she had come to work, not to become part of his personal life. But the more he tried to control his feelings, the more obvious they became to someone else. Baek Min-jae had started watching his father too. At first, it was only a glance across the dinner table. Then it became a pattern. Min-jae noticed that Hyun-woo listened differently when Kamaria spoke. He noticed that his father smiled around her. He noticed that Hyun-woo sometimes looked toward the kitchen when Kamaria wasn't there, almost as though he expected her to appear. To anyone else, these moments might have meant nothing. To Min-jae, they meant everything. The old fear returned. The same fear that had followed him since his mother's death began tightening its grip again. Min-jae remembered every woman who had entered the mansion before Kamaria. He remembered how his father had once been different before his mother's death. He remembered the locked bedroom, the photograph, the silence, and the feeling that his mother had slowly become a memory while his father continued living without her. Now Kamaria was everywhere. She had become part of the household routine. She could make Min-jae sit at the table. She could make Mrs. Han smile. She could make his father laugh. And worst of all, his father seemed happy around her. Min-jae didn't know that Hyun-woo's feelings were genuine. He didn't know that Kamaria had never asked his father for anything. He only saw the possibility he feared most. Another woman was becoming important to his father. Min-jae confronted himself with a question he had spent years avoiding. What if Kamaria wasn't trying to take his mother's place? What if she simply wanted to help? He rejected the thought almost immediately. His fear was stronger than reason. He convinced himself that Kamaria was slowly becoming indispensable. First, she had changed the household. Then she had changed him. Now she was changing his father. In Min-jae's mind, that couldn't be a coincidence. The woman he had once dismissed as another maid had become the person his father trusted most, and that made her dangerous in his eyes. He didn't understand that the very thing he feared was already happening for a completely different reason. Hyun-woo wasn't forgetting his late wife. He was finally allowing himself to live after years of grief, and Kamaria wasn't replacing anyone. She was simply showing him that love could exist again without erasing the person he had lost. But Min-jae couldn't see that yet. He only knew that he had spent years protecting his mother's memory by pushing people away. And now there was one woman he could no longer push away easily, Kamaria Revels, so Min-jae made a decision. If Kamaria was truly trying to take his mother's place, he would force her to reveal it. He didn't know what he was about to set in motion. He didn't know that his next attempt to expose Kamaria would bring another person into the story. And he certainly didn't know that the person standing behind that plan would eventually threaten far more than Kamaria's job. Because for the first time, Min-jae wasn't simply trying to make a maid cry. He was trying to protect what remained of his family. And this time, his fear was about to make him vulnerable to someone far more dangerous than Kamaria ever was. By the time Park Do-jin realized Baek Min-jae was changing, it was already too late to return the boy to the person he had been before Kamaria Revels entered the Baek mansion. Do-jin had known Min-jae for years. He understood his temper, his insecurities, and the subjects that could make him lose control. More importantly, he knew exactly how deeply Min-jae feared losing his father. For years, Do-jin had used that fear whenever he wanted Min-jae to do something reckless. He would remind him that wealthy families attracted people with hidden motives. He would tell him that employees were never truly loyal. He would suggest that anyone who became too close to Baek Hyun-woo probably wanted something from him. Min-jae had always listened. But now, every time Do-jin mentioned Kamaria, something had changed. Min-jae no longer immediately agreed. He had begun defending her. Quietly at first, then more openly. And Do-jin understood what that meant. Kamaria was no longer simply another maid Min-jae wanted to remove. She had become someone Min-jae cared about. Do-jin didn't like that at all. One afternoon, he met Min-jae away from the mansion and began reminding him of everything he believed Kamaria was doing. He told Min-jae that she had entered the house as a maid and within weeks had somehow become trusted by his father. She had changed the household routine. She had influenced Min-jae's behavior. She had earned the respect of Mrs. Han Mi-sook, and now Baek Hyun-woo seemed happier whenever she was nearby. Do-jin wanted Min-jae to see those changes as evidence of manipulation. He told him that Kamaria wasn't simply being kind. She was creating a place for herself inside the Baek family. Min-jae resisted the accusation at first. He told Do-jin that Kamaria had never asked his father for money or favors. Do-jin answered that was exactly what made her dangerous. According to him, the smartest people never ask for anything at the beginning. They wait until everyone trusts them. Min-jae didn't respond, but the words stayed in his mind because they touched the fear he had been fighting since the day Kamaria arrived. Then Do-jin gave him something more dangerous than words. A luxury watch belonging to Baek Hyun-woo. It was an expensive piece that Hyun-woo rarely allowed anyone else to handle. Do-jin had obtained it through someone who had access to the family's private storage area. His plan was simple. He would place the watch inside Kamaria's room and allow Min-jae to discover it. Once the watch was found, Kamaria would have to explain why an item belonging to Hyun-woo was hidden among her personal belongings. Do-jin knew exactly what would happen next. The family would become suspicious. Security would search her room. Kamaria would be accused of theft. And even if she denied it, suspicion alone could destroy the trust she had built. More importantly, Do-jin believed Min-jae would finally see Kamaria as a threat again. He expected the boy to expose her. He expected him to stand beside his father and say that he had warned everyone from the beginning. What Do-jin didn't understand was that Min-jae had already begun questioning the things he used to believe without evidence. The watch was placed inside Kamaria's room while she was working downstairs. Later that evening, Min-jae entered the hallway and noticed Do-jin behaving strangely. He didn't know exactly what had happened, but something about his friend's expression made him suspicious. Then Min-jae saw the watch. It had been placed where he would find it. He picked it up and immediately recognized it. For several seconds, he simply stared at the expensive object in his hand. There was no innocent explanation for why his father's watch would be inside Kamaria's room. If he showed it to Hyun-woo, Kamaria's position in the mansion could disappear before she had a chance to defend herself. If he said nothing, he would be allowing someone to accuse her of stealing. Min-jae's heart began beating faster. Only weeks earlier, he would have celebrated. This was exactly the evidence he had always claimed he needed. He could finally prove that another maid couldn't be trusted. He could finally convince his father that Kamaria had been using their family. He could finally make her leave. But then he remembered the woman sitting outside his mother's room. He remembered her telling him that she didn't believe he was as cruel as he wanted everyone to believe. He remembered the mornings when she had quietly encouraged him to sit with his father. He remembered the way she had refused to humiliate him when he struggled with household work. He remembered something else, too. Kamaria had never asked for anything. Not money, not jewelry, not special treatment. Not access to his father's business. She had spent her nights studying accounting because she wanted to earn her own future. And suddenly, Min-jae understood what Do-jin's plan meant. Someone wanted him to believe the worst about Kamaria without giving her a chance to speak. The same thing had happened to him for years. People had looked at his behavior and decided they understood him without asking why he was angry. Now someone was asking him to do exactly the same thing to her. Min-jae looked at the watch again. Then he made a decision. He removed it from Kamaria's room. He didn't confront her. He didn't tell her what had happened. He simply took the watch and returned it to the place where it belonged. Then he went back to his room and sat alone for several minutes, trying to understand what he had just done. The boy who had once spent his days searching for reasons to make Kamaria leave had secretly protected her. He had chosen not to use evidence that could have destroyed her reputation. He had chosen to believe her without even hearing her defend herself. It was a small act, but it represented the first real break from the person he had been. Kamaria never knew what had happened that evening. She continued working as though nothing had changed. But Do-jin knew. He had watched Min-jae remove the watch, and the realization made him furious. When he confronted Min-jae, he expected an explanation. Instead, Min-jae told him to stay away from Kamaria. Do-jin couldn't believe what he was hearing. He reminded Min-jae that Kamaria had changed everything inside the mansion. He told him that his father was becoming attached to her. He warned him that if Min-jae didn't act now, he might wake up one morning and discover that his mother's place in the family had been forgotten completely. But this time, Min-jae didn't react the way Do-jin expected. He told him that Kamaria hadn't done anything wrong. Do-jin laughed and accused him of being manipulated. Min-jae stood his ground. He told his friend that he had spent years blaming strangers for the pain he felt after losing his mother. He had decided every new person was an enemy before giving them a chance. And now, he was beginning to wonder whether his father had actually been the person he should have been talking to all along. That was the moment Do-jin realized he had lost control of him. Min-jae was no longer following instructions. He was thinking for himself, and that made Kamaria much harder to remove. Do-jin's expression changed. The friendship between the two boys had suddenly become something else. Min-yi had drawn a line, and Do-jin had no intention of respecting it. He told Min-yi that if he wouldn't get rid of Kamaria, then he would. Min-yi didn't understand the seriousness of those words until Do-jin walked away. He watched his friend disappear into the evening crowd and felt something he had never felt around him before. Fear. Not fear for himself. Fear for Kamaria. Because Min-yi knew something Do-jin didn't realize. Kamaria had already become part of the Baek family, and anyone who tried to hurt her would eventually have to answer to Baek Hyun-woo. But Do-jin had already made his decision. He wasn't going to attack Kamaria where everyone could see. He was going to make it look as though Kamaria had destroyed herself, and his next move would bring the entire Baek household dangerously close to believing that she had betrayed them. After Park Do-jin walked away from Baek Min-yi that evening, Min-yi tried to convince himself that he had made the right decision. He told himself he was protecting Kamaria Revels from Do-jin, but deep down, another thought kept bothering him. What if Do-jin had been right about everything else? What if Kamaria really was changing the Baek family because she wanted something from them? What if her kindness was simply another way of gaining his father's trust? Min-yi had spent years believing that people always had an agenda, and although Kamaria had given him reasons to question that belief, fear was difficult to erase. The photograph of his mother still remained inside the locked room. His father's grief still remained unspoken. And now Kamaria was becoming increasingly important to the man Min-yi feared losing most. Instead of talking to his father, Min-yi made the mistake he had made many times before. He allowed fear to make the decision for him. The next time Min-yi saw Do-jin, he didn't tell him to leave Kamaria alone. Instead, he asked what he would do if he wanted someone to leave without causing serious harm. Do-jin immediately understood what Min-yi was asking. He suggested one final prank. Nothing permanent, he said. Nothing that would seriously hurt her. Just something frightening enough to make Kamaria decide that the Baek mansion wasn't worth the trouble. Min-yi hesitated. He knew his previous behavior had already gone too far at times. He remembered the conversation outside his mother's room. He remembered the way Kamaria had looked at him when she said she didn't believe he was as cruel as he wanted everyone to believe. But then he imagined his father eventually telling Kamaria that she belonged in their family, and the old fear returned. Min-yi agreed. He told himself it would be the last time. He told himself Kamaria would simply become frightened and resign. He told himself nobody would get hurt. That night, the mansion became quiet one room at a time. Mrs. Han Mi-sook retired to her quarters. The security team continued its routine around the property. Baek Hyun-woo remained in his office, unaware that the greatest danger inside his mansion wasn't coming from an enemy outside the gates. It was coming from his own son. Min-yi waited until he believed everyone was asleep. Then he quietly entered the kitchen and took a small bottle of cooking oil. He stood there for several seconds with it in his hand. There was still time to stop. He could return it. He could go to his father's office and tell him everything. He could admit that he was afraid. But Min-yi had spent too many years hiding his fear behind anger. He walked upstairs instead. The hallway outside Kamaria's room was polished every night. Under the soft light, the marble looked almost perfectly smooth. Min-yi crouched down and poured a thin layer of oil across part of the floor. He didn't cover the entire hallway. He didn't think he needed to. In his mind, Kamaria would step onto it, lose her balance for a moment, perhaps drop whatever she was carrying and become frightened enough to decide that she had finally had enough. He would apologize if necessary. His father might be angry for a day or two, but Kamaria would leave and everything would return to the way it had been before she arrived. At least, that was what Min-yi told himself. He wiped the bottle, returned it to the kitchen, and went back to his room. Before closing his bedroom door, he looked once toward the hallway. He didn't know that he had just created the chain of events that would permanently change his relationship with his father. At 4:17 in the morning, Kamaria woke to begin her usual routine. She had become accustomed to the quiet rhythm of the mansion. She prepared herself, gathered what she needed for breakfast, and stepped into the hallway carrying a tray. She was thinking about her studies and the accounting exam she hoped to take when she could afford the fees. She was also thinking about something Min-yi had said the previous evening. For all his anger, she had begun to sense that the boy was changing. Slowly, reluctantly, but genuinely. She had no idea that within seconds she would be lying on the marble floor. Her first step was normal, her second was not. Her foot suddenly slid forward, the tray flew from her hands. The sound of porcelain striking marble echoed through the mansion. Kamaria tried to catch herself, but the polished floor gave her nothing to hold on to. Her body twisted and she fell hard. The momentum carried her dangerously close to the staircase. Her ankle struck the edge of the step, sending a sharp wave of pain through her body. She cried out and instinctively reached for the railing, but she couldn't stop herself completely. She landed on the floor, unable to stand. For several seconds, she simply lay there trying to breathe. Then she screamed for help. The sound traveled through the mansion. Baek Hyun-woo woke immediately. He had spent years training himself to react quickly to danger, and the sound of Kamaria's voice triggered something instinctive in him. He rushed from his room and ran toward the hallway. Security personnel followed behind him, but Hyun-woo reached Kamaria first. He dropped beside her and asked her to stay still. She was trembling. Her ankle was already beginning to swell. Hyun-woo looked at the shattered tray, then at the floor beneath his hand. His fingertips touched something slick, oil. He stared at it, then his eyes moved slowly toward the staircase. And there, standing several steps above him, was Baek Min-jae. The boy had been awakened by the scream. For a moment, father and son simply looked at each other. Hyun-woo didn't need to ask why Min-jae was there. Something inside him already understood. He stood. His voice was quiet when he asked whether Min-jae had done this. Min-jae couldn't answer. Hyun-woo asked again. This time, Min-jae's face collapsed. He admitted that he had put the oil there. He said he only wanted Kamaria to leave. He said he never intended for her to get seriously hurt. But Hyun-woo's expression didn't change. He looked at his son and told him something Min-jae would remember for the rest of his life. He said that Min-jae didn't have to want Kamaria to get hurt. He only had to understand that, when you deliberately create danger for another person, you are responsible for what happens next. Min-jae began crying. He tried to explain that he had been afraid. He said he thought Kamaria was taking his father away from him. He said he thought his mother was being forgotten. But Hyun-woo stopped him, not because those feelings didn't matter, but because pain could explain a person's actions without making those actions acceptable. Kamaria was taken to the hospital. The mansion became silent again, but this time, nobody felt peaceful. Hyun-woo stood alone in the hallway where the oil had been poured and stared at the place where Kamaria had fallen. He thought about every warning sign he had ignored, every resignation letter, every time Min-jae had pushed someone away, every time he had told himself his son would eventually grow out of it. He suddenly understood that his silence had allowed the problem to continue. He had protected Min-jae from consequences for too long because he had mistaken protection for love. When Kamaria returned, her ankle was badly injured, and she would need time to recover. Hyun-woo apologized to her personally. He told her that what happened had occurred under his roof, and he accepted responsibility for failing to protect her. Kamaria told him that she didn't blame him for what his son had done, but Hyun-woo refused to accept that answer completely. He knew that responsibility wasn't always about personally causing the harm. Sometimes it was about allowing the conditions for that harm to exist. Then Hyun-woo turned toward Min-jae. The boy expected punishment. He expected his father to take away his phone, his allowance, his access to his car, and perhaps send him away somewhere. But Hyun-woo had decided on something different. He would remove Min-jae's privileges, but he wouldn't remove him from the consequences. Until Kamaria recovered, Min-jae would take over the responsibilities she had been carrying. He would prepare meals. He would clean the rooms. He would do the laundry. He would serve breakfast. And most importantly, he would personally help Kamaria while she recovered. Min-jae protested that he didn't know how to do any of those things. Hyun-woo looked at him and answered that this was precisely the problem. For years, Min-jae had treated the people who performed those tasks as though they were invisible. Now he would discover how much work went into making the mansion function. He would learn that the people he had humiliated had names, dreams, families, fears, and limits. He would learn that a person's position in the house didn't determine their value. The next morning, Min-jae entered the kitchen for the first time without being served. The enormous room that had once seemed like a place where food simply appeared now looked completely different. There were ingredients everywhere: pots, knives, laundry baskets, cleaning supplies. Tasks he had never noticed suddenly surrounded him. And upstairs, Kamaria was recovering from the injury he had caused. Min-jae stood in the kitchen doorway for several seconds. For the first time, there was nowhere left to hide. The boy who had spent weeks trying to make Kamaria cry had finally been forced to face the consequences of his own actions. But what Min-yi didn't know was that Kamaria wasn't going to punish him. She was going to teach him. And the first lesson would be much harder than cleaning a mansion. It would be learning how to forgive himself without pretending he had done nothing wrong. When Kamaria Revels returned to the Baek mansion, she was moving much more slowly than before. Her injured ankle was wrapped and supported, and although the doctors had told her she would recover, she still couldn't walk without discomfort. The mansion looked exactly as it had before the accident. The marble floors were polished. The gardens were perfectly maintained. Security remained stationed around the property, but Kamaria noticed something immediately. Baek Min-jae was no longer looking at her with anger. He couldn't even look at her for more than a few seconds. The 16-year-old boy who had once made every maid nervous now seemed uncomfortable in his own home. His father had taken away his privileges, but that wasn't what had changed him. The real punishment was having to see Kamaria every day and know that the pain in her ankle was connected to something he had deliberately done. For the first time, Min-jae couldn't escape behind money, his father's reputation, or the excuse that he was only playing a harmless prank. His first morning caring for Kamaria was a disaster. He entered the kitchen determined to prepare breakfast himself, but he had no idea where anything belonged. He burned the eggs, overcooked the bread, spilled coffee across the counter, and nearly dropped the breakfast tray before reaching Kamaria's room. He stood there embarrassed, expecting her to laugh at him. Instead, Kamaria looked at the ruined breakfast and simply asked whether he had eaten anything himself. Min-jae said no. She told him to sit down. He looked confused. She explained that if he was going to care for someone else, he needed to learn how to take care of himself first. It was such a simple statement that Min-jae didn't know how to respond. He sat down and ate the breakfast he had nearly destroyed. Kamaria didn't mock him. She didn't remind him that he had once thrown food at other workers or deliberately created problems for them. She simply showed him what he had done wrong and how to do it better next time. The laundry went even worse. Min-jae had never realized how complicated something as ordinary as washing clothes could become when dozens of people depended on one household routine. He used the wrong setting, mixed items that shouldn't have been washed together, and managed to shrink one of Hyun-woo's expensive shirts. When he saw the damage, he panicked. He expected his father to be furious. Instead, Hyun-woo looked at the shirt, then at his son, and said nothing. That silence was harder for Min-jae than shouting would have been. He understood that his father wasn't interested in humiliating him. He wanted him to learn. Min-jae began realizing that the work Kamaria had been doing every day wasn't invisible. Someone had simply made it look effortless. The meals appeared because someone prepared them. The rooms stayed clean because someone cleaned them. Clothes returned folded because someone had spent hours washing and organizing them. For the first time, Min-jae began seeing the people behind the work. Days passed, and the changes became impossible to ignore. Min-jae still made mistakes, but he stopped complaining about them. He began waking earlier. He started asking Mrs. Han how certain household tasks were done. He apologized when he made mistakes instead of blaming someone else. He even began carrying things for Kamaria when her injured ankle made it difficult for her to move around. One afternoon, he entered her room carrying a tray and placed it carefully on the table. Kamaria thanked him. Min-jae nodded and began to leave. Then he stopped at the doorway. He turned around as though he had been fighting with himself over whether to ask the question. Finally, he asked why she was helping him. Kamaria looked at him for several seconds before answering. She told him that someone had to show him what he was capable of becoming. Min-jae looked down. He said he didn't understand why she would care about what he became after everything he had done to her. Kamaria didn't pretend his actions had been acceptable. She told him that what he had done was wrong, and she reminded him that forgiveness didn't erase consequences. But she also told him that one terrible decision didn't have to become the definition of his entire life. Min-jae sat down. For several seconds, he said nothing. Then he finally admitted the truth he had been hiding since the day Kamaria arrived. He told her that he had believed she was trying to replace his mother. He thought that if he made Kamaria leave, his father would never find another woman to love. He thought keeping every woman away was the only way to protect what remained of his family. Kamaria listened without interrupting. Suddenly, all those months of anger had a different meaning. Min-jae hadn't been protecting his father. He had been protecting the memory of his mother. Kamaria asked him whether his mother would want him to spend the rest of his life afraid of losing her. Min-jae didn't answer. His eyes filled with tears. He admitted that he couldn't remember the sound of her voice as clearly as he used to. That frightened him. He thought that if his father loved another woman, the memories of his mother would disappear even faster. Kamaria told him that memories didn't work that way. Loving someone new didn't erase someone who had come before. She explained that people could carry more than one kind of love in their hearts without replacing anyone. Min-jae finally understood something his father had never been able to explain to him. Hyun-woo had never stopped loving his wife. He had simply been afraid to move forward, and Min-jae had spent years trying to force his father to remain trapped in the same grief. That realization changed something inside him. Later that evening, Min-jae watched his father and Kamaria speaking quietly in the garden. Hyun-woo was smiling. It wasn't the polite expression he sometimes gave business associates. It wasn't the controlled expression he used when dealing with enemies. It was genuine. For a moment, Min-jae simply watched them. Then he turned toward Kamaria and said something that made her pause. He told her that his father hadn't smiled like that in years. Kamaria looked toward Hyun-woo. She watched the way he listened to her, the way his expression softened when she spoke, and the way he seemed more at peace than he had been since the day she arrived. Suddenly, the pieces she had been trying not to connect began fitting together. Hyun-woo's questions about her studies, the way he remembered small details about her life, the way he had refused to use his power to control her, the way he had looked devastated when she was injured. Kamaria had noticed all of it, but she had deliberately kept her distance because she was his employee and because she understood the complicated position she occupied inside his family. Now, hearing Min-jae acknowledge his father's happiness made it impossible to dismiss what she had been sensing. There was something genuine between them, something neither of them had spoken aloud. Min-jae looked at Kamaria again and told her something else. He said that he had spent years believing his father could only love one woman. Now he understood that his father wasn't trying to replace his mother. He was simply trying to live again. And for the first time, Min-jae wasn't angry about it. He was relieved. Kamaria didn't answer immediately. She looked toward Baek Hyun-woo standing in the garden, unaware that his son had just given Kamaria permission to see what had been growing between them. But there was still one problem. Kamaria was not simply a woman Hyun-woo had fallen in love with, she was still his employee. And Hyun-woo knew that if he wanted any future with her, he couldn't use his wealth, his authority, or his position to influence her decision. He would have to give her a choice. And that choice would come sooner than either of them expected. Because within days, Kamaria would receive news that could take her away from the Baek mansion permanently. And when Hyun-woo heard the news, he would have to decide whether to fight for the woman he loved, or let her walk away. By the time Kamaria Revels' ankle had healed enough for her to walk without assistance, the Baek mansion had become a completely different place. The woman who had arrived 3 weeks earlier carrying one suitcase now knew every hallway, every routine, every quiet corner of the property. She knew which breakfast Min-jae preferred when he was upset. She knew when Mrs. Han Mi-sook needed help before the older woman asked. And she had learned that Baek Hyun-woo, despite his reputation as one of Seoul's most feared mafia bosses, carried a loneliness that money and power had never been able to fix. But Kamaria also knew something else. Her original reason for coming to the mansion had not changed. She had come to work, save money, and return to her education. Now she had finally saved enough. The opportunity she had been fighting for was within reach. She could return to school, finish her accounting studies, and build the independent life she had imagined before she ever walked through the Baek family's gates. She made the decision quietly. There was no dramatic announcement. One evening, after finishing her responsibilities, Kamaria packed her belongings and placed her books carefully into her suitcase. She looked around the small room she had occupied since arriving and felt something she hadn't expected. Leaving the Baek mansion no longer felt like simply leaving a job. It felt like leaving people she had grown to care about. She thought about Min-jae, the boy who had once wanted her gone and now asked whether she needed help carrying something. She thought about Mrs. Han, who had become more like family than a supervisor. And then she thought about Hyun-woo. That was the hardest part. Kamaria had begun to understand his feelings, even though he had never said them aloud. She had felt them in the way he looked at her, in the questions he asked about her future, and in the way his expression changed whenever she talked about leaving. But she also knew that staying because she felt sorry for him would be unfair to both of them. The following morning, Kamaria told Hyun-woo that she intended to leave once her recovery was complete. He listened without interrupting. She explained that she had saved enough money to return to school and that she had received an opportunity to continue her education. She expected him to ask her to stay. Part of her even feared that he might use his influence to make the decision difficult. After all, this was Baek Hyun-woo. He was a man accustomed to controlling circumstances. If he wanted someone to remain in his world, he had the power to make leaving extremely difficult. Instead, he surprised her. He told her that he was proud of what she had accomplished. Kamaria looked at him, almost confused by the response. Then Hyun-woo said the words he had been holding back for weeks. He told her that he would never use his power to keep someone he loved. Kamaria froze. For the first time, there was no misunderstanding. He hadn't called her a valued employee. He hadn't called her a friend. He hadn't hidden behind the responsibilities of the household. He had simply told her the truth. He loved her. Kamaria looked down because she didn't know what to say. She had spent weeks trying to convince herself that whatever existed between them was only gratitude, admiration, or the closeness created by difficult circumstances. But Hyun-woo's confession made that explanation impossible. He wasn't asking her to stay. He wasn't offering her money. He wasn't using his position to influence her. He was giving her exactly what she had wanted from the beginning, a choice. He told her that if her future required her to leave Seoul, he would understand. If she wanted to continue her education somewhere else, he would support her decision. And if she never returned to the Baek mansion, he would still be grateful that she had entered their lives. Kamaria finally admitted that leaving was not as easy as she had expected. She told Hyun-woo that when she first arrived, she thought the mansion was simply a workplace. She never expected to care about the people inside it. She never expected Min-jae to become important to her. She never expected to look forward to conversations with Hyun-woo. And she never expected to stand in front of a man she once knew only as her employer and realize that she had fallen in love with him. Hyun-woo didn't try to hide the relief in his expression, but he still didn't ask her to abandon her dreams. Instead, he told her to finish her education. He told her to become the woman she had always intended to become. And then he told her that if, after accomplishing that, she still wanted him in her life, he would be there. That was the moment Kamaria understood why her feelings for him had become so strong. Hyun-woo had everything that could have made him controlling. Wealth, power, influence, fear. Yet when it mattered most, he chose to give her freedom. The man who could command almost anyone in Seoul was willing to accept the possibility of losing the one woman he loved rather than force her to stay. Kamaria smiled through tears and told him that she didn't know what the future would bring. But she knew she didn't want to lose him either. Months passed. Kamaria returned to school. She studied harder than she ever had before, determined not to waste the opportunity she had fought so hard to earn. She worked through difficult exams and long nights, balancing her education with the emotional weight of knowing that somewhere in Seoul, a man was waiting for her. Hyun-woo never pressured her. He didn't demand constant contact. He didn't interfere with her studies. Sometimes he simply sent a short message asking whether she had eaten. Other times he sent books related to her studies without signing his name. Min-jae changed too. The boy who had once seen Kamaria as an enemy began treating her absence as something that made him understand how much she had mattered. He still had difficult days, but now he talked to his father instead of turning his anger against everyone around him. He even admitted to Hyun-woo that he missed Kamaria. Eventually, graduation day arrived. Kamaria walked out of the university building holding her certificate, surrounded by classmates and the evidence of a goal she had once feared she would never achieve. She looked toward the street and stopped. Waiting, there was Baek Hyun-woo. He stood beside one of his black vehicles, dressed simply compared with the extravagant suits he wore at business gatherings. But he wasn't alone. Standing beside him was Min-jae. The 16-year-old boy who had once decided that Kamaria would become the 10th maid to leave the mansion was holding a bouquet of flowers. When Kamaria approached, Min-jae looked almost embarrassed. He handed her the flowers and told her that she had done it. Kamaria thanked him. Then Min-jae looked at her with a smile that would have been impossible to imagine on the day she arrived. He told her that she had come to the Baek mansion to work for them. Then he admitted that somehow she had become the person who brought his family back. Kamaria looked at Hyun-woo. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The way he looked at her carried everything he had been unable to say during those months apart. Kamaria stepped closer. Hyun-woo reached for her hand, and for a moment they simply stood there surrounded by people who had no idea how much had changed since the day she entered the Baek mansion. Then Hyun-woo asked her if she would come home with him. Kamaria smiled and said yes, but there was one more question he had been saving. He told her that he didn't want her to return to the mansion as a maid. He didn't want her to return because she owed him anything. He wanted her to return because he wanted to build a life with her. Then he asked Kamaria Revels to marry him. Kamaria's eyes filled with tears. She looked at the man who had once been her employer, then at the boy who had once tried to make her leave, and finally at the future she had never imagined when she first walked through those gates. She accepted. Hyun-woo slipped the ring onto her finger, and for a moment neither of them spoke. Then he gently pulled her closer. Kamaria looked into his eyes, and Hyun-woo kissed her. It was not a hurried kiss or a display for anyone watching. It was the quiet expression of two people who had spent months learning that love wasn't about possession. It was about trust, patience, choice, and the freedom to walk away even when staying would be easier. When they finally pulled apart, Kamaria smiled through her tears. Hyun-woo touched her face gently, and she rested her hand against his. Their wedding took place several weeks later. Baek Mansion, once known as the house where maids entered carefully and left in tears, was filled with family and close friends. The same corridors that had once carried arguments now carried laughter. Mrs. Mi-sook stood proudly as Kamaria prepared for the ceremony. Min-jae stood beside his father, dressed formally and looking older than the 16-year-old boy who had once spent his days trying to make Kamaria's life miserable. When Kamaria walked toward Hyun-woo, Min-jae watched his father smile. There was no anger in him now, no fear that his mother had been replaced. He understood something he had not understood when Kamaria first arrived. His mother's memory had never been in competition with Kamaria. His father could love his late wife and still find love again. And Min-jae could carry his mother's memory without destroying every relationship that came after her. After the ceremony, the reception continued late into the evening. Kamaria noticed Min-jae standing near the edge of the room, watching the celebration. He was smiling to himself. She walked over and asked him what was so funny. Min-jae looked at her for several seconds before admitting that he was remembering the first day she arrived. He remembered how certain he had been that she wouldn't last a week. He remembered the spilled drink, the arguments, the fear, and finally the terrible morning when everything went wrong. Then he smiled and told her that he had spent weeks trying to make her cry. He paused, looked toward his father, and admitted that now he was the one trying not to cry. Kamaria laughed softly and pulled him into an embrace. Min-jae hugged her back. And in that moment, the relationship between them was finally complete. She was no longer simply the maid he had tried to drive away. She was family. The Baek mansion had once been a place where people entered carefully and left in tears. But one woman refused to let fear decide who she was. Kamaria didn't defeat Min-jae by humiliating him, overpowering him, or forcing him to change. She changed him by showing him that pain did not have to become cruelty. She showed him that losing someone did not mean everyone who came afterward had to become an enemy. And Hyun-woo learned something too. A man could have enough power to control almost everything around him and still need the courage to let the person he loved make her own choice. Perhaps the most unexpected part of the entire story wasn't that Baek Hyun-woo, one of Seoul's most feared mafia bosses, eventually fell in love with Kamaria Revels. It was that the 16-year-old boy who had once wanted her gone became one of the people who wanted her to stay. Min-jae had spent years believing that protecting his mother's memory meant preventing his father from loving again. In the end, Kamaria taught him that love wasn't a limited resource. A new person entering the family did not erase someone who had already been loved. It simply created room for another kind of happiness. And that was why the wedding photograph meant more than anyone outside the family could understand. In it, Baek Hyun-woo stood beside Kamaria, smiling in a way Min-jae had almost forgotten was possible. Min-jae stood beside them, no longer looking like a frightened boy guarding the memory of his mother, but like a son who had finally accepted that his father was allowed to be happy. Mrs. Mi-sook stood nearby, watching the family she had served for years finally become what it had always needed to be. And Kamaria stood at the center of it all, the woman who had entered the mansion believing she was only accepting a job. She had arrived with one suitcase. She had come for a paycheck. She had planned to save money and return to school. She never expected to become the person who changed a troubled 16-year-old boy, reopened the heart of a grieving mafia boss, and transformed a mansion filled with fear into a home filled with people who finally chose one another. So if you were Kamaria Revels, after everything Baek Min-jae had done to you, would you have forgiven him and stayed with the Baek family, or would you have walked away the moment you had the chance? Because sometimes the person who hurts you most is not the person who remains the same forever. Sometimes they become the person who learns exactly why they were wrong. And sometimes, the family you never expected to have becomes the family you were meant to find.